Hey everybody, it's Meredith. It is September 3rd, 2025, and I wanted to give everybody an update on the whole Mosaic, aka Sport Pilot 2.0 situation. So this arrived in the mail about, a week ago. It's the September 2025 edition of EAA Sport Aviation magazine. And as you can see on the cover, they are prominently featuring Mosaic because this was the emphasis item for AirVenture. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody's been going crazy about it. But I wanted to point out a couple things from the cover story article, which is here, located in the magazine on page 39. So for those of you at home who are members of the EAA and who receive this magazine, you can follow along. But for those of you who aren't, I wanted to read to you just a few snippets from this article. Now, of course, they are quoting the marketing slogan, half the time, half the cost, all the fun, which they have been promoting for some time now. And you'll see in the video, I have some photos that I took at AirVenture when I was there back in July, showing EAA advertising this. So on page 39, they say, quote, EAA has been training pilots in our 3-week Sport Pilot Academy in an average of 35 hours. Well, good for them. And you'll see in a few minutes here, I included a snippet from a lecture that I attended at AirVenture, hosted by one of the Sport Pilot Academy instructors who's not an EAA employee. He was just one of the instructors, but he shares some of his thoughts about that academy. But nonetheless, EAA is claiming that they get those folks through in about 35 hours. The article continues, the FAA estimates that the national average training time for a private pilot is around 75 hours. Now, that's what the FAA has on their website, but as you'll see, as I've mentioned in previous videos, that is actually not correct. The average number of hours for a private pilot is currently hovering just shy of 100 hours, not 75. The article continues, this is very much a, quote, your mileage may vary situation, but a no-frills sport pilot curriculum at a non-towered airport without add-on endorsements saves at least a dozen hours over private pilot. This in turn shrinks down the real-world calendar days needed for training with more emphasis on core skills. Now here's where I want you to think about this. They're saying that a no-frills curriculum, I'm not quite sure what they mean by that, but I can guarantee you here at Holiday Aviation, we do not provide no-frills flight training. But they claim that such a scenario for a sport pilot would leave more emphasis on core skills. Now, as you've seen me mention in my previous videos, two of the, quote, core skills, in my opinion, that are not required for the sport pilot are instrument training and night flying. So I'd like all of you to think about this. If we are proposing here in Sport Pilot 2.0 that sport pilots will be able to fly something like a Cessna 172 cross-country, are you telling me that instrument flying training and night flying training are not core skills for a sport pilot flying cross-country in a cross-country capable airplane like a Cessna 172 or a Piper Cherokee or anything else that meets the new performance requirements and limits under Sport Pilot 2.0? You're trying to tell me those are not core skills? I have an issue with that, EAA, so I think you ought to reconsider that position. Nonetheless, you can check it out. There's EAA Sport Pilot, Sport Aviation magazine. So the next thing I want to cover in this video is the recent email exchanges I've had with folks at the FAA about a question I have regarding Sport Pilot 2.0, and that deals with the issue of how do we, as flight instructors, how are we supposed to determine that an applicant, a student pilot, is seeking sport pilot privileges versus seeking private pilot privileges under the new rules, aka Sport Pilot 2.0. So if I have a student pilot at my flight school who shows up with a desire to learn how to fly. They've got a fresh little logbook. They don't have a medical yet, and many of our student pilots who are flying in furtherance or seeking a private pilot certificate don't have a medical yet either. So they can start their flight training just fine, but we assume that at some point down the road, they're going to have to obtain an FAA third class medical or higher in order to act as pilot in command in that Cessna 172 on their first solo. We just encourage them to get it sooner rather than later, because if they encounter any challenges in the medical certification process, like something comes up in their medical history that's a red flag, who knows? We don't want them getting shot down at the medical certification point 20 hours into the flight training program and then suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I can never continue because I can't get a medical. Now, in theory, this is one of the advantages of the Sport Pilot Certificate because you do not need to go through that process at all. You can avoid it entirely and just use your driver's license. Now, there are certain restrictions imposed upon sport pilots even today, flying light sport aircraft without a medical, but nonetheless, you could solo a light sport aircraft without a medical, but you can't currently solo a Cessna 172, for example, without a medical. But you can start the training. So when I start the training with someone in a Cessna 172, again, we assume that they are eventually going to seek a private pilot certificate because that, under the current rules, they would need a private pilot certificate in order to act as pilot in command with full privileges in a Cessna 172. They can't currently act as pilot in command in a Cessna 172 without a medical. However, under Sport Pilot 2.0, they can. But this issue during the training process is, what certificate is the pilot seeking? And as far as I can tell, and I've read this thing backwards, forwards, multiple times, I can't find any way that we as the flight instructors are supposed to legitimately document or ascertain what certificate a student pilot is seeking. That will affect whether or not they need a medical in order to solo my Cessna 172. Now, I've sent multiple emails to the Orlando FSDO, the Flight Standards District Office that covers our area, as well as to FAA headquarters, and I'll put those up here in a screenshot. And I still have not received an answer to my question there. So I hope that they do provide an answer, because otherwise I don't see any way that I can offer sport pilot training to a customer when this rule goes into effect on October 22nd, unless I get a sufficient answer to this question. And I'll tell you why. Even under the current rules for private pilots, we see this a lot. Now, I get customers coming in from other flight schools and they'll bring me their logbook, and part of my due diligence as the owner of the flight school is I will audit their logbook line by line, endorsement by endorsement, making sure that all their previous training at their other flight school or flight schools was correct. And if I notice any anomalies or anything missing, I will point it out to the customer and say, hey, you need to get this corrected by your previous flight school, or I'm sorry, the flights that you did not count and we're going to have to repeat it. Now, I've had multiple conversations with the various DPEs, or designated pilot examiners, who are the guys who conduct the check rides in our area, about some situations with student pilots coming in with errors in their logbook. And it can get to the point where, they, as the DPE, as the representative of the FAA, they are held accountable to the FAA for what they accept as experience in the student's logbook when a student comes to them presenting for a certificate. The DPE is held accountable for making sure that that is correct also. So if they were to allow a pilot to go through and issue them a certificate based on successful completion of the practical test, when the previous training that they conducted was incorrect or missing, the DPE and the pilot can get in serious trouble for that, and they have. There have been cases where this has happened. In fact, one of the DPEs told me of probably the most egregious situation I've heard of, and this did not happen to him personally, but he knows of this situation occurring, is when a private pilot applicant presented for an instrument rating practical test. And the examiner noticed that the private pilot had not completed all of the required training for the private pilot certificate. There were errors at the student pilot level. And you know what the FAA did? They yanked the pilot's private pilot certificate and deemed it invalid and made him go back and take his private pilot check ride all over again before he could continue on and take the instrument practical test. So words matter and accuracy of logbooks matter. And this is what I've been preaching here, is that this isn't a matter of me just misinterpreting something. Okay, if I'm misinterpreting it, then my bad. But if I've noticed an error in this, I'm quite confident that there's other flight instructors out there, maybe you're one of them, who've also been scratching your head and wondering, well, what am I supposed to do with this? And my advice to you, which is the advice I'm going to follow for myself, is I'm not going to touch this thing with a 10-foot pole until I can get clarification from the FAA. So we'll see what they say. The only clue I could find is in a draft version of Advisory Circular 61-65, which is the document that flight instructors use for guidance on issuing endorsements. This draft has been circulating in a few flight instructor forums online. The first thing I noticed is that a key sentence has been removed, which previously indicated that the advisory circular was just that, advisory. It's unclear to me whether this AC will be incorporated by reference, as the AIM suggests it could be. The next thing I noticed in the draft version of AC 61-65K is a change to how student pilot certificate applications may be processed. It seems to suggest that student pilots may apply for the required student pilot certificate using FAA Form 8710-11, shown here. AC 61-65J, the current version, does not mention using Form 8710-11 as an option for processing a student pilot certificate. For many years now, the FAA has recommended using its online application system, better known as IACRA, for processing all pilot certificate applications. The current version of IACRA, shown here, does not provide an option for designating student pilot sport or student pilot private. I'm guessing that most flight instructors, like me, never went to law school. Let's hope that the FAA gets all of these important details sorted out by October 22nd, or I'm afraid that Sport Pilot 2.0 is going to be a big, ugly train wreck.
My name is Craig Strowinski. I'm a CFI, II, advanced ground instructor, and instrument ground instructor, and I also have my 107 certificate. So as you can tell, I like flying. I'm a Sport Pilot Academy instructor here for EAAs. And now the pathway to private becomes much shorter. It's not one big step. It's sport pilot, building time, building PIC time, that's still in your logbook. So when you want to go for the instrument rating, and if you're doing it Part 61 and you need that 40 hours of cross-country PIC time, you could have done that as a sport pilot rather than having to now go and build that. So it becomes a much more seamless integration to move through those ratings if you want to.
Sport pilots need to be very careful when building and logging PIC time, especially cross-country and instrument time for the instrument rating and the commercial pilot certificate. Another really important factor to consider is the extra time and expense associated with preparing for the private pilot practical test if your intention is to earn a sport pilot certificate and then upgrade later on. You're not really saving yourself any time or money by doing this. If you're able to get an FAA medical and your intention is to ultimately earn a private pilot certificate, just do yourself a favor and skip the sport pilot thing and go straight for the private.
You mentioned in your slide how this will make it easier for sport pilots to engage in personal transportation, and you're talking about the instrument rating. Why didn't the EAA push for requiring sport pilots to have a bit more instrument training, given that they're now going to be doing the same things essentially as private pilots that need 3 hours?
So the question was, why did the EAA push more on the issue of instrument rating? And I can't comment specifically on what the EAA's position was with respect to policy that way, so I can't answer that question.
Well, what do you feel as an instructor?
Well, you know, from an instructional perspective, the instrument rating is a whole different ballgame, right? And why people get an instrument rating varies. Some people do use it and they do fly in instrument conditions. Some people use it as an opportunity to advance their training. Some people need it as part of their career path. For example, and we'll talk about this in a minute, to be a CFI, you need to have an instrument rating. To be a sport pilot CFI, you don't, right? And so when you start building in those things, you start, I think, limiting the attractiveness, right? Even as a private pilot, you need to have 3 hours of instrument training, under the hood training, right? Those types of things. So the idea behind Sport Pilot, I think, was to eliminate a lot of those things that people didn't necessarily feel was necessary and give them the option later on to take advantage of that if they want to.
So are you saying that you feel that the 3 hours of instrument training for the private pilot is unnecessary?
I'm saying it's probably insufficient as an instructor.
So why wouldn't a sport pilot then require the same? See what I'm saying? If a sport pilot is taking a cross country in a 172 and a private pilot is, this guy over here doesn't need it, this guy over here does.
It's a difference between being required and being desired, right? If I were, if I were working with a sport pilot, right, I would definitely, and they were interested in doing cross-country flying, I would definitely stress upon them the value of that training. It would still be their choice. They wouldn't have to spend that 3 hours. They wouldn't have to pay me 3 hours. They wouldn't have to rent the airplane for 3 hours. But if they are a responsible person and they are going to be taking friends and family, it would behoove them to get that training. If you go to, for example, even in Europe, you can't even fly at night under a private pilot's license. It is basically an instrument rating to fly at night. So we're much more liberal in our granting of pilot privileges here than they are in Europe with respect to flying in, say, non-VFR, daytime VFR conditions.
But the reality is, according to the FAA's data, sport pilots are not voluntarily getting that training now. So why would they do it in the future?
Again, that would be, I think, an opportunity for a flight school or a flight instructor to impress upon them the value of it, as opposed to the requirement. When we do things because we're required, we never get as much out of it as when we're motivated to do it. So I think that becomes something from the instructor community that can impress upon those students or those pilots the importance of, just like spin training or anything else, upset training, those are all great things to do, and there's all good reasons to do them. The difference is, do we mandate it or do we motivate it?
So the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is the sport pilot practical test versus the private pilot practical test. Now, if you look at the private pilot airman certification standards, and I'll put up a screenshot here of what that looks like. If you compare the private pilot airman certification standards to the sport pilot practical test standards. Now, two different names for the documents. Years ago, the FAA started transitioning all of these test standards documents to a format called ACS, which is a bit more verbose, but the attempt, and I think it was a good one, is to incorporate all of the knowledge subject areas that are on the knowledge test into the practical test itself. So it just sort of evens the playing field. It sort of aligns all of the knowledge test standards with the practical test standards. It just makes for kind of a longer document, but whatever. I think it clarifies things a fair amount. But they didn't do all of the test standards. They didn't update all of the test standards at the same time. There's still a fair amount of them that are still in the old PTS format. And one of those is the Sport Pilot. So I have no idea when the Sport Pilot ACS will get published. But as far as I know, the PTS is going to be updated per the FAA to align with the new Mosaic standards, but it doesn't appear that it's going to be updated to an ACS, but we'll see what happens on October 22nd. So I'm going to pull up here a document that I produced that compares the private pilot ACS with the Sport Pilot PTS. And as I go through this, I'm going to read to you different sections of it, but I want to kind of highlight some of the key differences and similarities. And hopefully what you'll find at the end of this comparison is that an applicant presenting for either a sport pilot or a private pilot practical test really needs to prepare the same things. They have to prepare a navigation log for the cross-country exercise. They have to do much of the same maneuvers. The only thing they don't have to do, a sport pilot doesn't have to do, that a private pilot does, is the demonstration of instrument proficiency. In other words, being able to control the airplane by reference to instruments. They also don't have any discussion of night flying because sport pilots, at least under the current standards, are not allowed to fly at night. So, special emphasis areas in the sport pilot PTS, these things are incorporated into the knowledge areas on the private pilot ACS, and they seem to be fairly well aligned. Then we go to area of operation 1, pre-flight preparation. When we go to task C, weather information, in the sport pilot PTS, it says that the sport pilot must describe the importance of avoiding adverse weather and inadvertent entry into IMC. So they're asked about it verbally, but they're not required to demonstrate the ability to deal with this situation. And the sport pilot also must explain courses of action to safely exit from an inadvertent IMC encounter. Okay, so they have to know what to do in their head, but they don't have to demonstrate what they would actually do if they were presented with the situation. Now, when we go to the private pilot ACS, under task C, weather information, it includes a lot more information there that the applicant is expected to discuss, like personal weather minimums, use and limitations of installed onboard weather equipment, aviation weather reports and forecasts, and in-flight weather resources. Now, I find it interesting that none of this is included in the sport pilot PTS, even though many of the light sport aircraft that are currently flown by sport pilots and others, because you don't have to be a sport pilot to fly a light sport airplane, you could be a private pilot or an airline pilot for that matter. But I just find it interesting that sport pilots aren't currently required to address any of these sort of technology advancements in weather forecasting and display, even though most of the light sport aircraft that are on the market tend to be fairly well equipped. In other words, they will have some sort of glass cockpit presentation, a PFD or an MFD. They may have ADS-B in and out. They may have a ballistic parachute. So these are not cheesy little airplanes. Most of them are fairly well equipped. So why is a sport pilot not required to discuss or demonstrate competency with these things? I have no idea. So now we'll move on to task D, cross-country flight planning. And one difference I noticed between the sport pilot PTS and the private pilot ACS is that in the private pilot ACS, pilots can be asked about use of an electronic flight bag, or EFB, if used. Now, this is something like ForeFlight on an iPad or an iPhone. This isn't addressed at all in the sport pilot PTS for whatever reason. Okay, now we get to task F, operation of systems, which is actually task G in the private pilot ACS. Now, as we get into this, remember, under Mosaic, sport pilots and private pilots can fly, in many cases, the exact same airplane. That's what all of these alphabet industry groups, including EAA, have been promoting, is that now basically any GA airplane that's out there on the ramp at your favorite local airport is now accessible to a sport pilot. So under the current rules, again, we're looking at the current sport pilot PTS. The objective says to determine that the applicant exhibits knowledge of the elements related to the operation of systems on the light sport aircraft provided for the flight test. We can assume that the FAA will do a similar word swap in this PTS for the sport pilot as they're doing in the regulations, where they will take out the word light sport aircraft and perhaps just leave it aircraft. In the private pilot ACS, currently, under operation of systems, they talk about things like secondary flight controls, environmental controls, de-icing and anti-icing systems, and indications of and procedures for managing system abnormalities or failures. This verbiage is not included in the current Sport Pilot PTS, even though obviously airplanes, like your average light sport aircraft with decent equipment, would have environmental controls like heating, cabin heat, or ventilation. So now we're at area of operation 2, pre-flight procedures. Properly program and manage the aircraft's automation as applicable. Again, many modern new manufactured light sport aircraft include lots of automation. They have autopilots. They may have electric trim. They may have, of course, GPS and other things to make the pilot's life a bit easier. So the fact that this is missing from the Sport Pilot PTS is a bit problematic in my opinion. Now, Task D, taxiing, is incredibly detailed under the Private Pilot ACS and very, very minimal in the Sport Pilot PTS. Appropriate flight deck activities prior to taxi, including route planning and identifying the location of hotspots. Again, this notion of hotspots has been around for a long time. I don't know why it is not mentioned under the taxiing task for a Sport Pilot. Then we get to the before takeoff check. And here's where there's a subtle difference between the two, but an important one in my opinion. So this is Task F, before takeoff check. Under the Sport Pilot PTS, number 5, it directs the pilot to review takeoff performance, such as airspeeds, takeoff distances, departure, and emergency procedures. Now, under the Private Pilot ACS, they drill this down into a little more detail. And under knowledge, it says the applicant demonstrates understanding of ensuring the aircraft is in a safe operating condition as recommended by the manufacturer. So this means when you do the run-up, making sure that all your parameters are correct. Then under risk management, it says the applicant is able to identify, assess, and mitigate risk associated with unexpected runway changes by air traffic control. Again, something that's certainly in play for a Sport Pilot operating out of a towered field. Potential power plant failure during takeoff or other malfunction, considering operational factors such as airplane characteristics, runway takeoff path length, surface conditions, environmental conditions, and obstructions. This is a biggie. This ties into our AQP for general aviation. And even though the FAA doesn't label it AQP, good on them for at least taking a step in the right direction on the Private Pilot ACS and alluding to the fact that the private pilot applicant, before takeoff, should make sure that they are thoroughly briefing the takeoff and all the what-ifs that could occur after departure. But this is just very generally mentioned on the Sport Pilot PTS as emergency procedures. I'm not going to get into every single one here, but there's just lots of examples in the Sport Pilot versus the Private Pilot tests where something legitimately could have been addressed in the Sport Pilot practical test, but just isn't, I think, because they were just trying to make it brief and easy, because Sport Pilot is easier, right? Not. Okay, let's move down now to the flight tasks. And here's where it gets kind of interesting. And if you have the document open, you can scroll down with me too. In the Sport Pilot PTS, it's area of operation 8, slow flight and stalls, and this is area 7 in the Private Pilot ACS, if you're following along. So here's where it gets interesting. Now again, even under the current rules, where a Sport Pilot taking a check ride for a Sport Pilot certificate by design can only be flying a light sport aircraft. So you're less than 13, 20 pounds, 2-seat, something or other airplane. Versus a private pilot could be flying that same plane, but they could also be flying a Cessna 150, 152, 172, Cherokee, you name it. Nonetheless, slow flight is something that needs to be performed by both applicants. Now, the sport pilot applicant, it says to determine that the applicant selects an entry altitude consistent with safety, which allows the task to be completed no lower than 1,000 feet AGL. Okay. Now we go over to the private pilot ACS, the very same task, which could be completed in the very same airplane by a sport pilot or a private pilot applicant. The private pilot applicant says, select an entry altitude that allows the task to be completed no lower than 1,500 feet AGL. So why the 500-foot difference? Why was there ever a 500-foot difference in the minimum altitude for a sport pilot versus a private pilot? And I don't even care about the airplane. Because again, under the current rules, you could take your private pilot check ride in a properly equipped LSA. All day long, no problem. We did that for years when I was working for a flight school back up in Maryland that had some of those Piper Sports, aka check sport aircraft. Most of our applicants were working on a private pilot certificate. So why is it okay for a sport pilot to do slow flight at 1,000 feet above the ground, but a private pilot has to do it at 1,500 when they're both supposed to be doing it at an altitude, quote, consistent with safety? Never made any sense to me. The other big difference between those two is that for the sport pilot, again, under the current PTS, for slow flight, says establishes and maintains an airspeed at which any further increase in angle of attack, increase in load factor, or reduction in power would result in an immediate stall. Versus the private pilot ACS, this was changed several years ago to say, establish and maintain an airspeed at which any further increase in angle of attack, increase in load factor, or reduction in power would result in a stall warning, such as the aircraft buffet, stall horn, etc. So again, even under the current rules, why did the FAA not simultaneously make the sport pilot PTS match these parameters for the private pilot? Makes absolutely no sense. And we see the same thing with the stall series, with power off stalls and power on stalls. Again, you've got a 1,000-foot AGL hard deck for the sport pilot, but a 1,500-foot hard deck for the private pilot. And under Mosaic, this could be happening again in a Cessna 172. Same airplane with same performance, same everything, but if you're a sport pilot applicant, you get to go 500 feet lower, and it's okay for whatever reason. Instrument maneuvers are not tested on the sport pilot practical test, even though sport pilots are required to get just a teeny bit of instrument training to satisfy the requirements under FAR 6193 for cross-country privileges. So it's not like sport pilots have never ever done any of this stuff before, and it is considered an emergency procedure, even for a private pilot. So why aren't sport pilots tested on it? Doesn't make any sense. The emergency descent, moving on to area of operation 9. Emergency descent is not a task in the current pre-Mosaic sport pilot PTS. And I'm not sure why, because let's face it, even a very nice light sport aircraft of whatever vintage, whether a grandfathered older airplane or a newly manufactured one, could still have a problem wherein the pilot might want to execute an emergency descent, like a fire. Why is this only a possibility for the private pilot? Again, could be in the same airplane. Private pilot taking a practical test in a light sport aircraft that's properly equipped. They have to do the emergency descent, but the sport pilot doesn't. That never made any sense. I hope you see now that even under the current rules, the differences between the sport pilot PTS and the private pilot ACS are kind of arbitrary and nonsensical. And I certainly hope that when the FAA gets their act together and updates the Sport Pilot PTS, hopefully publishing it as an ACS to align with the private pilot, we will have a little more agreement here. But under the current rules, this doesn't fly.